Welcome to another Prepared to Answer podcast. My name is Sean Walker, and I want to invite you to join Scott as he speaks on how to face doubts with confidence and grace.
My prayer is that God would really use this to strengthen your faith. And I recognize that, especially in a subject like guarding your faith, I realize that there really are probably two kinds of people that I'm speaking to today. One is the Christian who recognizes the rapid change in our culture and the challenge to bearing witness for Christ in an ever-changing world. And I hope this speaks to you in giving you tools for that next God-appointed conversation that you're going to have where you could bear witness for Christ and that you could do so with more confidence. The second person who is here is probably the person who, as Peter mentioned earlier, is struggling to maintain or hang on to faith in such a rapidly changing culture. That there are so many questions, as you mentioned, celebrity pastors who are relinquishing the faith and things like that, and it causes us to kind of be shaken in our confidence. And so my hope is that you'll be spoken to as well, that this will not only equip you for that maybe conversation, but for those of you who are here who may be slipping in doubt in your own heart and mind. My prayer is that either way, God's going to use this. And so we'll entrust that to him. I've entitled this Guarding Your Faith in a Post-Christian World. The term post-Christian, I think, is problematic in and of itself, only because I'm not really sure to what extent, of course, we're talking about our culture. I'm not really sure to what extent we ever could have called Canada a Christian nation. I understand the umbrella of Christianity that very much shaped our broader culture, but I'm not sure what we mean when we say a Christian culture in the first place. But I think what we understand in general is that the culture and the cultural landscape has very much changed over the last little while. And increasingly, especially and I'm so encouraged to see so many young faces here, the emerging generation of believers in North America, and of course our concern is Canada. This is going back even about a decade now, that study after study, and even while I was still in pastoral ministry, seeing that there were multiple studies being done that were demonstrating how quickly the emerging generation, at this time we would have called these millennials, now we're looking at Gen Z, right? The generations keep changing names and labels. I can't keep up. But the degree to which and the rate at which young people were departing from the Christian faith they were brought up in. You grew up in a Christian family where your practice was regularly going to church and you were taught the fundamentals of the Christian faith. The statistics are not good. That 7 in 10, as high as upward. Even I looked at studies that were specifically just directed toward evangelical Christian families, and the rates were still around 60%, which is very alarming. And of course, was mentioned just at the beginning there, what seems like a continual barrage of deconversion stories. We hear names like Rob Bell, who was a very famous pastor in the States, who really has departed from an orthodox Christian belief into something that's more akin to, I think, just a general spirituality, a belief in maybe a deistic kind of God, but certainly not the gospel of Jesus. More recently, someone like Josh Harris, who I remember discipling young people in my youth group with Josh Harris's books, right? And he's now announced that he just can't maintain this conviction of Christianity anymore. Famous or well-known speakers like Jen Hatmaker, or artists like John Steingard of Hawk Nelson, which is a Christian punk band. I don't know if you are aware of it or not. But these kinds of names, and more recently I've heard this name thrown around, and you've probably maybe watched some of their YouTube videos, Rhett and Link, who are now, they call themselves internet-tainers. But these two guys who have a really engaging online presence, but their background is they used to work with Campus Crusade for Christ. And very recently they came out and said, you know what, we can't hang on to this Christian faith that we were brought up in any longer, and they've kind of moved into a position of, I think they would just call themselves agnostic. They just don't know. So they're just kind of keeping their eyes open, or their doors open. Of course, the jury's still out about what the end of the story will be for any of these people. This could be that their faith has been shaken to a point where they can't hang on to it anymore, but we don't know what God will yet do, and we hope that he would yet restore them. But we understand, and even just in listening to the broader narrative of our culture that seems to be pervading the airways, especially through Hollywood, I'm noticing more and more as I watch just popular programs, and the way that Christianity is caricatured. Oftentimes people will bring up, the historical embarrassments that are somehow hitched to the Christianity wagon, like the Salem witch trials and things like that. Interesting footnote of history. No one was ever burned at the stake in Salem, by the way. There were some people that were hung. It was a horrible event. But somehow things like that are hitched onto Christianity for some reason. Of course, there's some more public things that are more recent, and we understand, even back a couple of decades and more recently, seeing very public disgraces of very public Christian spokespeople, which you see that and we just cringe. More close to home and even more recently, and this is one that has really caused me to struggle and the grief over the revelations about the residential schools in our own country throughout history. So many of them, of course, run by churches, right? And this terrible discovery of, the kinds of things that went on and the loss of life, to say nothing of the kind of emotional and personal turmoil that went on in the lives of these children and their families. And we look at that and we lament. And you might even in your own experience be struggling with some of these aspects or challenges to faith that are leading towards these kinds of deconversion or faith deconstruction kinds of experiences. People who have experienced judgmentalism in the church, and maybe you're one of them. I am. Has anybody ever been judged by somebody in the church? I have. Has anybody ever judged anyone in the church? I have. But some people have had particularly painful experiences and they walk away disillusioned. Or for those of you, if you've ever had the misfortune of being part of a church where there was a breakup or a split, that really shakes your faith. It causes you to question at a very deep and profound level when you see Christians who cannot reconcile differences that ought to be reconcilable. And it causes us to shift and to wonder, or even the experience, and this may be you, of you're trying to hang on to your faith, but you are just struggling to see its relevance to your life in the world we're in now. What does this really have to do? Look at the world around us. Look at everything that's happening, right? The world, through our devices, is right in front of us. We see the world's events, how things are unfolding. And what does what I have to do on Sunday morning, what does that have to do with what's really happening in the world? And we struggle with those kinds of questions. And you may be that person sitting here right now, and you may be, and you don't want to let anyone know, but you're here and it's like you're clinging, to the edge. To try and hang on to that faith that mom and dad taught you so well, right? Or that you just has been a part of your community for so long, but you're just barely hanging in there. Maybe that's you. Or maybe you're going to face that person who brings up so many of these kinds of things and challenges you, right? This is Christianity. What do you say about this? Is this the faith that you have and want to defend? Well, how do we guard ourselves then? Whether it's guarding our own hearts in the midst of our own battles or struggles, or it's guarding our faith in the kinds of conversations that, Lord willing, God brings into your life as you would live out being an ambassador for Christ in this world. And we certainly need to do that, every one of us who calls on the name of Christ? Well, there's a couple of things I want you to be aware of. First I wrote beware, and then I thought, oh, that sounds too... But I want you to be aware, which is really what beware means. But beware sounds more like a negative warning. But two things to be aware of. To recognize and be able to identify that when it comes to doubt, whether you're doubting your own faith or someone else is casting doubt upon the faith in Christ that you profess, we're going to talk about two kinds of doubts that you need to be able to identify and recognize and know how to respond to appropriately, and also to be aware of two kinds of overreactions that people, when they're struggling in faith, tend to go to one extreme or another. First, I want to tackle the two kinds of doubts to understand and be aware of, to recognize. The first kind of doubt is kind of more of an intellectual doubt. It's the kind of doubt that we may struggle with or be confronted with that asks the question, is Christianity really true? The second kind of doubt is an emotional doubt, which is more of a doubt of the heart. And it's the kind of questions that are really asking whether Christianity is truly good. Okay, there's differences. Intellectual doubts are common questions, kinds of questions like these. Isn't the Bible hopelessly corrupted? How can you follow the Bible? It's this old book that was written by a bunch of crusty old men centuries ago, and how do you even believe it anymore? Doesn't the Bible contradict science? How can you, as a rational person, believe this old book of fables and tales? Or did Jesus really rise from the dead? Right? Paul said this is the absolute core of our faith, that Christ rose from the dead. But did he? How do we know that? Can we know that? Right? These are intellectual doubts. These are questions. Emotional doubts come more in the form of these kinds of questions. How could a good God, how could a loving God ever send someone to hell? Why are Christians so judgmental? And how can you be a Christian and justify the terrible things that Christians have done in the past? So, those are the two kinds of doubts that we tend to face. And we also need to recognize that there tends to be two kinds of overreactions when we're wrestling with trying to find firm footing in our faith. Sometimes the first overreaction is the one of total skepticism. And I'm finding more and more in our culture, we are experiencing an extremely skeptical culture. Skepticism is almost being put forward as the new form of intelligentsia, right? If you can question something, that shows you're really smart, right? So doubting is the new kind of smarts. The notion that we can't know truth with any certainty. Like that's the position of real wisdom, is not to be able to say we can know anything with certainty. The other extreme, though, is the total other direction, is that we can know things with absolute certainty. In fact, the most important things we do need to know, we must be absolutely certain on. Both of those, I think, are going to get us into hot water. So I just want to talk about these overreactions for a moment, just to kind of expand on them a bit. That the overreaction of skepticism, or extreme skepticism, really makes this statement. It wants to say this, either directly or implicitly, that since it's always possible that you could be wrong, you really can't be certain about anything. But I want to ask you a question. I want to just see what you think. What's wrong with that statement? What's wrong with taking this kind of position? It actually might sound humble. It might sound even pious, but what's wrong with it if we take that kind of extreme? What problem can it create for us? What problem does it create?
You never come to a conclusion.
Yeah. If that's the case, thank you. If that's the case, then that means no one can really know anything. And the problem is it's self-refuting, because that includes the skeptic, who is, in being skeptical, making or asserting a confident truth claim. One thing I know for sure, I can't know anything for sure. It's self-refuting, for starters, but it leaves us in a horrible position, right? It leaves us continually, uncertain about anything. How do we live? We can't live that way. And the reality is we don't live that way. Even the skeptic doesn't live that way. They live as though they confidently do know certain things. And so sometimes when you face that, what you need to do is just to try and point out, that's not a sustainable, it's not a livable position. And look, you don't even live that way. There are some things you know for certain. That's why you look both ways when you cross the street. Because you know for certain if there's a bus coming, you know for certain what's going to happen, right? The other extreme, of course, is absolute certainty, and absolute certainty is kind of an anxious position. It's a position that says that in order to really know something with confidence, in order to really believe that something's true, I have to be 100% certain about it. Otherwise, I can't believe that it's true. What's the problem with this?
You end up not believing anything about it.
Yeah. It ends up being the case that if that's the case, then there's very little that we could say we would ever believe. Of course, if you've studied philosophy and the history of philosophy, that was Descartes' problem, right? The only thing he could be certain of was that he was doubting, that he was doubting everything. Doubting's a form of thinking, I think, therefore I am. But that created a very untenable foundation for knowledge. That is, everything starts with reason, and that led to a host of other problems. But yeah, in that case, there's very little, if anything, we can really know. But the possibility of being wrong or the impossibility of being 100% certain does not eliminate our ability to know things confidently. It doesn't. That's not how we come to a position of confident knowledge. The way we come to know things with confidence is we entertain or we use all forms of information or knowledge gathering skills, right? We use our reason. We look at evidence. We measure our experiences. And a perfectly legitimate source of knowledge is good authority. We look at these kinds of things, these kinds of evidences, and we weigh them, right? I look at something and I realize there's good reason for this, but I also recognize there might be reason against it. And so I look at the reasons and I weigh them. Or I look at the evidences and I weigh them. Or I measure the experiences. Is it possible that you're not in this room right now, that maybe you're just dreaming all of this? Is that possible? It's possible. Does that mean you should doubt that you're even here? No, because I've experienced being in rooms like this before, and I've experienced dreaming, right? And I can weigh the difference. And there are probably some reason-based tests I can perform to make sure I'm not dreaming. You could give me a pinch, would be a help. We weigh those things together and we come to conclusions. And knowledge isn't something we have to have absolute certainty about in order to be confident. Knowledge and confidence of what we know is even something we can grow in over time as we gather more information, as we weigh evidence and experience and even authority. Which means that even in the process of coming to know things, doubt is part of the process. It's part of asking questions, and we ought to do that. And so, if you're here today and you're doubting, you've got deep doubts about your own faith, don't see that as a sign of lack of faith. That it could be that what God is doing is seeking to strengthen your faith by causing you to ask questions that are going to make you have to search in ways you haven't before. I think asking critical questions of Christianity is a good thing. And the reason I think that is because I'm confident that if we are honest before the Lord and we seek the truth with the help of His Spirit, looking into His Word, that He will show us what is true, and we will grow in our confidence. Which is why Peter said to add to your faith goodness, and to your goodness knowledge. Knowledge is something we should be growing in as Christians. But there's something else we need to recognize, is that, this is how we come to know things in the world. It's how the common person does around your neighborhood or in your school or in your family. But beneath all of this, we all stand upon, or all of the knowledge that we hold or build our lives upon, rests on an ultimate foundation. And maybe you've heard this referred to as our ultimate worldview or ultimate assumptions about the world. That ultimately, everyone's knowledge is built upon a foundation of their ultimate assumptions about the world. Whether it's conscious or not, that's the case. I'll give you an illustration of this from an experience I had. I was speaking at a university a number of years ago in Waterloo, the University of Waterloo. And I did a talk one night on, is it reasonable to believe in God? And went through my talk, and afterwards students came up and we had some good discussion. And a really nice young man, he had a German accent, he was from Germany, and he was doing a master's in it was either astrophysics or particle physics. Whatever it was something that I couldn't even ask him an intelligent question about. He came up to me and said, I really enjoyed your talk. He said, I'm not a Christian. He said, I don't mind the idea. He says, I'm open to the idea of God. But you need to understand something. I was raised, the way my parents raised me, they raised me to think scientifically. That I need evidence in order to believe something. I have to see it. I have to prove it scientifically. And that's my problem, is I can't prove God through science because I can't believe anything unless I can prove it scientifically. And so for this young man, his ultimate foundation for what he could really know was science. And he was just raised that way. And of course, even in our culture, I'm not sure anyone would say that strictly, but certainly in our culture, science is kind of put forward as a foundation of knowledge that's just a lot more secure than pretty much any other foundation. And it's often set in contradistinction or in opposition to faith. But that was this young man's foundation, was science. What I said to him in response was, because I certainly could not, I'm not a scientist, and so maybe my knee-jerk response would have been, I wish I could come up with some scientific evidence for God, right? And there's lots of good scientific, apologetic kind of material out there. But that's not I'm not a trained scientist. I love that stuff, and I've read lots of it. But this guy was in a master's in particle physics or some kind of physics, so I wasn't going to go there with him. But what I did find interesting is I wanted to challenge the statement he made about how it is he thinks he knows what's true. He said, I can't believe something unless I can prove it scientifically. And my response to him was, but you already do. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, the thing is, you believe your foundation for knowledge is science, but it's not. I said, the problem is that you need to understand methodological science, the kind of science that we do in our culture, that you're doing here in the university. That kind of science actually rests upon a number of assumptions that you can't prove scientifically. In fact, your science requires you to hold those assumptions in order to get off the ground. For instance, I said, you believe in the existence of a theory-independent external world, right? Something real that science can observe. He said, yes. I said, you believe in the laws of logic, that the laws of logic actually correspond to this theory-independent world. I said, you believe in the reliability of your cognitive senses and your sense faculties to actually observe accurately and gather data about the world. You believe in the uniformity of nature. You take for granted, you assume that the laws of physics will not change tomorrow, right, as you do your science, that they will remain constant. And you believe in the existence of a mathematical truth, and that this theory-independent world corresponds to non-physical mathematical quantities. And that's a reality. The reason why we can discover so much about our world, even things we can't see, is because the world corresponds to mathematics. There are actually a host of assumptions, there are about 20 in total, that undergird modern methodological science. I said, now, you believe all these things are true, right? He said, yeah. I said, now, but your science doesn't prove them. I said, rather, you require to believe them in order for your science to work. He said, yeah, I guess I do. My question to him was, well, then why do you believe in them? I said, I believe in them too. I believe those things are true also. But the reason I believe that they're true, the reason I believe that there's an ordered, mathematically, congruent, logical, rational universe that we can actually observe and know real facts about, the reason I believe that is because I believe that the earth, the universe was created by a rational creator. That's why those things make sense to me. My question to him was, why do you believe they're true? So what this just illustrates is that we need to understand whoever we're talking to or whoever we are. Anything that we would claim to know and that we can know with confidence ultimately rests upon our worldview. And I liken it to a house. If a house is the knowledge that we have, the walls, the roof, are the things that we know, then our worldview is the foundation. It's the thing that the house rests upon. And so in helping people think about, even work through the kinds of doubts they may have, we want to help them, or even ourselves, think about our ultimate set of assumptions, our worldview, what our knowledge is built upon. Now, it's interesting that Solomon actually says it really plainly in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7. For us, what is the ultimate foundation for knowledge, for that which we can know to be true? He says the fear of the Lord. That's the beginning of knowledge. That's our foundation. My question to my friend was, what's the foundation? What's the underlying reason? What's your ultimate starting point for holding not only those assumptions, but those assumptions are true by which you can do your science? And his response, I'll never forget it. He was such a nice guy. I wish I could have gotten to know him. His response was so honest. He said, you know what? I don't know. I guess I've never really thought about it. And that was honest. He hadn't thought about it. I never saw him again. I never got to talk to him again. I still pray for him from time to time. But praying that God would have taken that conversation along with any others, believers he could have put into that young man's path over time, and caused him to start asking questions. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the second session, but we need to understand that an important part of our witness and in growing our own confidence of faith is to identify and put to test the strength of our worldview beliefs, the strength of what holds up everything we would claim to know, and in other words, proving the integrity of our worldview. So whether we're wrestling with overreactions of skepticism or absolute certainty, or we're talking to someone who is, our task is to move toward clear and honest thinking about the assumptions that we hold and why we hold them. You see, it's not enough for someone just to say, look, Christianity is this or that. Here are all the reasons why you shouldn't believe. They may say that. And so what they're doing is they're questioning the foundation for all that you know. But realize that as they're doing that, they have to be standing on something too. They can't just keep questioning and questioning and questioning without having to, at some point, defend their own position. Defend where they're standing. What's the foundation that you're resting your understanding of the world, your knowledge, your beliefs? What does it rest on? And then asking the question, can that foundation, can your worldview support what you believe to be true? Of course, for the Christian, we understand that there is one firm foundation upon which all of our knowledge is built. And that's Christ. Christ is the foundation. He's the starting point. We don't need some evidence or some argument or something else that will undergird Christ and make him legitimate. He doesn't need that. He is the foundation. He is the rock, not just for faith, but for knowledge. I can't count how many times in the New Testament the Apostle Paul in particular describes coming to faith in Christ as coming to a knowledge of the truth. Right? Our faith is about coming to know what is real, what is really the case about God and the world and our lives in relationship to both. But it all focuses on Jesus. Here's what Paul said in Colossians chapter 1, verse 15 to 20. He says that the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. That includes all of the people in this world who don't believe in him or who reject him. All of the nations, all of the world's powers, everything was created through Christ and for him. He's before everything. And in him all things hold together. And he's the head of the body. He's our head. That's the head of the church. He's the beginning and the firstborn. That means he has supremacy in terms of rank and position ahead of everything, everyone in all creation, including from among the dead, so that in everything he would have supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Everything in all of creation, whether it's the angels in heaven or humanity on the earth or Satan and his forces, all things are being brought to one under the head of one authority, and that's Christ Jesus. And the things that God is redeeming, he is redeeming through Christ's blood. So the one thing I want to avoid or beware of doing in the ministry I have, which is apologetics, the skill or the equipping of defending our faith. That sometimes we think of apologetics and defending our faith as a real intellectual exercise. We have to become intellectuals to learn all these arguments, to counter every challenge. We sometimes think about apologetics like it's Christian ninjutsu. Like we just have to learn the right answers and any question we can defeat. And it doesn't work that way. That we can't change people's minds. We can't cause them to see Christ on our own. That it's Christ who opens people's eyes. And that when he does, when he makes himself known to them, just as if you're a believer here, the moment he made himself known to you, you put your faith in him, but you were responding to that which God made known to you. Your faith is grounded in knowledge. That's knowledge of Jesus who makes himself known to us. So, the foundation for true knowledge upon which Christians through all ages have stood secure is Christ. Let's ask any question we need to ask, but let's not forget where we go back for our confidence, where we look to anchor and secure our faith. It's Christ. Right? So, having said that, I want to just move for a moment to then how we go about defending when doubts come, whether it's doubts come into our own minds we wrestle with, or doubts from others that they challenge us with, whether they're intellectual or emotional. And this is where the work of, or the study of apologetics can be so useful. And it's grounded in, of course, the instruction of Peter in 1 Peter 3, 15 to 16, where Peter says this, and this is why I wanted to punctuate so clearly why Christ is our foundation. He starts this way. He says first, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. If you want to confidently and capably and effectively bear witness for Christ in this world, such that people would listen to you and hear you and engaging with you, they might have their eyes open to Christ, then first and foremost, Christ must be Lord of all in your life. He wants all of you. Your heart must be completely and utterly His. And here's why. Because you cannot pass on that which you don't possess. How will you effectively bear witness for Christ if He is not first and foremost your everything? But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Then Peter says, and always be prepared to give an answer. The word he uses is apologion. That's where we get our English word apologetics from. To give an answer or a defense to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. And in great part, the apologetic enterprise of kind of what we're used to in apologetics, much of it is scientific, but there's historical and archaeological, so much that's evidence-based, so much of it is so effective in responding to the intellectual kinds of challenges. And I think that's absolutely invaluable. And you know what? If you have a real aptitude for some of those things, then by all means, if God has given you a capacity in the sciences, or even in the histories, or in archaeology, or any of those things, if you have a passion in that, then use it for Christ. If you're majoring in the sciences, even if you're in a secular university, ask God how He can use you to take your scientific education and use it to reveal God to the world. But then Peter goes on and says, but do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. And I think Peter includes that, and oftentimes in apologetics, we overlook that part of the passage because we're so interested in the evidential arguments, right? The proofs that will stand up, and get accolades, I guess, maybe in the more academic circles. Don't get me wrong, those things are valuable. I just love, people like William Lane Craig and other scholars, John Lennox and people like that, who can stand up and talk about how mathematics reveals a creator and those kinds of arguments. I love that. But sometimes we just go there and we forget that we're not just dealing with intellectual doubt, we're dealing with emotional doubt. And that the way we respond is just as important as what we say. We respond with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, realizing that some people you talk to may not have any intellectual doubts about Christianity. They may be all emotional. They've been hurt, or they see things in the news and the spin, and they say, I don't want that because that's not good. And what they need an appeal to, what they need a response to, is their heart. And that's the role of, and I think equally, of an apologetic, of giving a verbal defense, whether it's to the intellect or to the heart. We prepare ourselves to answer to whatever that might be. And I would almost argue with you that as I watch the landscape Vijay even mentioned the changes even in the last few years, the opposition that I am hearing and seeing against, publicly speaking, against Christianity in a public discussion, I feel is more emotional than intellectual. There's more heat than there is light. There's more anger than there is real curious questioning or intellectual doubt. And so I think this part of becoming skilled responders in gentleness and respect is going to pay dividends if we can learn that. So you don't have to be an expert in particle physics to speak well to a particle physicist. You could be a regular person like me and learn to do that. As an example, we're getting close to closing this discussion, but I want to use an example to kind of illustrate what I mean, and this maybe set the stage for our next talk of how to defend your faith without getting defensive. But I've been thinking a lot about this in particular, I think because it hits so close to home. And I feel so convicted about the history of what's happened in our nation, and I feel, it's just this deep disappointment that the church, I know not my church, I know maybe not this church, but the church is implicated. And I think, well, how are we ever going to respond to that? The damage that's done. Sometimes I shake my head and I go, Jesus, why in the world have you left your public reputation in our hands? I'm not sure he's left it in our hands, but for some reason he's chosen to associate with us. But I think there's also something to be learned in that and something to be communicated. I think about this and I think, okay, what if someone approached me and said the obvious? Look what the church, look what Christianity did. Look at the oppression committed by Christianity. Here's where all of you who moved up are going to be so glad you moved to the front row. What would you say? You thought I'd just give you the answer. Let's try it on. What would you say? No one wants to take a stab at it. I know. I'm not exactly sure what I would say either. Sometimes I have to work through these things and practice them in anticipation that it might come up. But whether I have the exact words, here is how I would respond, or here is how I would work to steer the conversation. First of all, we certainly can't get away from it. You know what? You're sickened by that, so am I. Those things were awful. I can't believe that happened in our country. In schools run by churches, by people who call themselves Christians. I agree with you. Those are awful. I'm in shock. But here's where I would want to steer the conversation. I wouldn't want to try and downsell the history or try and clarify the detail. I wouldn't even try that. Because this is a calling into question the goodness of Christianity. Here's what I would ask. But what makes you say that Christianity was the cause of this? Help me understand. Why are you saying that Christianity is the cause? The obvious answer would be because it was Christians who did those things. Of course, Christianity is the cause. Those are Christians. ostensibly. You might say, oh, but what we could say is that, you know what? Not all people who call themselves Christians are really Christians. I don't think that's a good answer. I wouldn't go there because we have no way of knowing. And I'm convinced, knowing my own history, Christians can do terrible things. Anyone here done something that they never want anyone in the world to find out about? Okay, me and the couple in the front row. Of course we have. So, where do we point a person? Where do we take an emotionally charged, legitimate, heartfelt challenge like that? Here's where I would take it. That may be true, and it may be, and it probably is. But how can Christianity be the cause when those things that were done, whether they're done by Christians or not, go directly against what Jesus teaches? You see, when defending the goodness of Christianity, we need to steer the conversation back to the goodness of Christ, right? Because Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. And love your enemies. And be generous to the poor. And give freely to anyone in need. And do to others as you'd want them to do to you. And even lay down your life for your friends. That's what Jesus taught. That's how he taught his followers to live. So doesn't it seem like the problem isn't Christianity? The problem is people claiming to be Christians who don't live like Christ. Isn't that the problem? Yes, that's the problem. The problem is that maybe there are imposters, people who take the name Christian who shouldn't. But I guarantee you there are those who are Christians who also are culpable. We can't get away from it. Don't deny it. You know what? Affirm what we can affirm. Mea culpa. I've done things too. But see, that's the whole point of the gospel. I don't know why Jesus has decided to leave his brand associated with a group like us, but that's the good news of the gospel, is that broken, sinful, flawed people he embraces as his own. And he takes their obvious sin and the evil and the wickedness that they do, and he washes them clean of it. And he forgives them for it. He takes the weight of it upon himself and releases them from the guilt and says, I forgive you, and makes sinners his children. That's the good news. You could leave them with a question. Can you imagine a world where everyone did live according to what Jesus taught? I don't know how the person would respond to that. But if you just watched what I tried to do in that conversation, and I haven't had this conversation yet. It's probably coming. But to move the conversation away from church, establishment, history, and move it to Christ. And get them to think about Christ and to hear what Christ has to say. Jesus can represent himself very well. He's like Teflon. Right? No one can pin anything to him. He was the perfect man. And even in a world that is so quickly departing from Christ, people still revere him. He's taken care of his own reputation, even where his people have done many things to sully it. So, just a quick review. We learned about two kinds of overreactions that we want to avoid. Either avoiding them in our own minds or learning to identify them in people we might be speaking to. And how to shift our understanding of how we find security and knowledge away from those extremes of skepticism or the anxiety of having to have absolute certainty, and just to recognize that we can know things with confidence, and that ultimately what we know is established upon the ultimate foundation. We stand our ultimate assumptions, our ultimate worldview. And for those of us in Christ, that foundation is Christ. I love the way that C.S. Lewis put it when talking about Christ as the foundation for everything he saw in the world. He said, I know that Christianity is true, like I know that the sun is in the sky. Not only because I see it, but because by it, I see everything else. You see, Christ is what illuminates and makes understandable our life in this world. That's why he's our foundation. And so I encourage you to continue to build upon that foundation, that Jesus truly does make sense. And the more I draw closer to Christ, the more he makes sense of this world and my life and my understanding of what everything's about. And the person without faith might not see that, and they might question you and look at you cockeyed and think you're crazy. That's okay. But as you're standing there, as we said, as you stand there, then help them to look at their own feet and ask them what they're standing on. No question, nothing to hide here. I'm standing on Christ. He's my foundation. What's yours? Why do you believe what you believe to be true? How do you know it's true? What's your foundation? We then looked at two kinds of doubt, the intellectual and the emotional, and that our apologetic, our preparedness is to be ready to answer either of those, to identify, is this an intellectual doubt or an emotional one? And then we took a quick look at how to deal with a specific emotional one. And really, this is a good template for any. And I even tried to do this when dealing with intellectual doubts. I always try to leave the person with Christ. I always try to point them to Jesus. I always try to get Christ's words out of my mouth, because I'm convinced they will not see the light because I gave them a clever explanation of something, right? They will only see the light if Christ opens their eyes, as he did for you and for me.
This podcast has been a ministry of Prepared to Answer. Our mission at Prepared to Answer is to help prepare, equip, and encourage the Church of Jesus Christ to grow in confidence of faith by teaching Christians to think like Jesus. To access more resources to help you begin understanding life and the world around you with the mind of Jesus, visit our website at www.preparedtoanswer.org. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Prepared to Answer. Or contact us directly by email at info@preparedtoanswer.org. May the Lord bless and keep you.